Hey, this is Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 5 of my series entitled Sound Quality and Authenticity in Heavy Metal and Hard Rock, Implications and Controversies. And this is part 5, and what I'm doing in this particular episode is I'm really hitting head on, I think, the trade-off between an artist's quest for good sound quality and authenticity. Sometimes there's a trade-off there. And we're going to look at this specifically from the perspective of the live album. Okay, so let's just get rolling. And as always, check out the links below. There's links that'll take you to my YouTube channel, so you can check out other YouTube things that I've done, as well as you can read the text in its entirety if you'd rather do that. All right. So the appropriateness of sort of live albums, right? Very controversial topic that's been controversial kind of for decades amongst heavy fans, or at least the ones that care about this stuff. So weighing the merits of good sounding recordings versus faithfully documenting live presentations is a common point of consternation amongst many music fans, as I was saying. Actually, the debate over live albums brings in elements of all parts of this paper, so it's almost a bit of a pseudo summary in some respects, by literally pitting together sound quality and authenticity, right? So again, we'll see how that trade-off works. I'm going to talk about a few iconic live albums. Then we're going to look at one specific live album as a really good case in point with a lot of controversies around it. And then I'll widen the discussion as how live albums can be a good surrogate for the authenticity sort of debate in general. All right. So we'll start with this. The 1970s have become renowned for the decade in which live albums ruled, and in some cases cemented a heavy band's legacy forevermore, right? So it's not that live albums aren't important today. They are, right? Actually, bands put out more live albums these days than kind of ever, right? But I think live albums today actually have a different role than they did in the past, and I will expand on that later on in this discussion. Right. But I don't think anybody will disagree that the 1970s were probably the key decade for live albums, especially for heavy music. Right. Now, what I've got here is a list, and I won't go through them in any detail. I'll comment on each one a little bit. But what I've got here are, I don't know, it's about a dozen of them. I would suspect that any heavy fan of a certain vintage, if you're my age or maybe not, you don't have to be as old as me, but people who have been listening to heavy music for, say, quite a while, you're going to know about these albums. In all likelihood, they're probably in your collection. In a lot of cases, you've probably worn them out. You probably know them super well. And I would also encourage some of the younger fans out there, younger fans who are maybe newer to heavy metal and hard rock. If you haven't heard these albums, do yourself a favor and stream them, check them out, etc., because they truly are benchmark recordings. Yeah, they lean a little more towards hard rock than metal. Certainly Judas Priest's first live album, though, would be metal. But this is hard rock, proto-metal, perhaps, right? But I think, if I can say it in my own humble way, kind of essential listening if you've never heard this stuff. So anyway, and I'm sure others could add a few more to this list. This is just a few examples of iconic live albums of the 1970s. Deep Purple, made in Japan, one of the earliest one on the list, came out way back in 1972. I mean, I'll try not to sound too fanboy about this stuff, but that is my all-time favorite live album. I could talk about it all day. I won't, but I could. Uriah Heep's live album came out. Their first live album came out in 73, also absolutely iconic. Bloister Cult's On Your Feet or On Your Knees, 75, a little rougher sounding, but again, terrific. Now, all of these albums, I should mention, is along with Kiss Alive, and on it goes. In a lot of ways, these albums were sort of important markers in time, right? That these often a band would release a key live album and it sort of closed a chapter in their career. It represented, often these were, in almost all cases, these were the earlier parts of bands' careers. And then after that, they went in different directions, right? So they performed a lot of different roles in addition to be sort of greatest hits packages as well, right? And that's the case really for almost everyone I'm mentioning here, that they really feature the early material of the band and often in the absolute best possible light. Kiss Alive, I mean, their first live album, say what you want about Kiss, you know, they're a joke, whatever. That is still to this day one of the most important live albums of all time, as far as I'm concerned. Rush's All the World's a Stage, again. Rush released a ton of live albums over the years, all of them really great, I might add. But I don't know that they ever captured the magic of a Rush live show as they did on their very first one. Led Zeppelin's The Song Remains the Same. Again, their first official live album. It also was based on a film. Again, a lot of people's favorites. Foghat's live album. For people that maybe, you know, aren't as into, say, the boogie bluesy side of hard rock, and Foghat certainly is in that camp. It's amazing, though, how those bands came across so much heavier if you found them live, and that would be a great example, right? Their studio stuff, I love it, but yeah, it's bluesier, not quite as hard-hitting. When you hear them live, it's a whole different story. AC/DC's first live album, If You Want Blood, You've Got It, featuring the late, great Bon Scott, I might add. Again, an absolutely iconic live album. Ted Nugent's Double Live Gonzo, again, say what you want about Ted. His political stuff can get a little crazy. But man, when Ted wanted to rip it up, he could really do it. And Live Gonzo really proves that. Scorpions Tokyo Tapes, again, really, again, like I say, with so many of these albums, after bands often go, you know, after they release an iconic live album, that's usually a sign that they're going to go in a different direction. The Scorpions certainly did. This is the last album with Uli Roth on lead guitar. And to me, that makes all the difference. The Scorpions went in a completely different direction when Uli left, and this caps the Uli era terrifically, right? Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous. A lot more to say about that one. That's going to be my case in point, and we'll talk about a lot of the controversies of live albums. It's not alone, but it's a great example of a lot of the contention. UFO Strangers in the Night. Again, Michael Schenker, one of the all-time great guitar players, I think, in almost anybody's book. If you're a long-time fan of hard rock, you'll know about Michael Schenker. Michael's released an enormous amount of material, live, studio, etc., with UFO, with MSG, etc. But many would argue he was never more on fire than he was for this particular album. Judas Priest, Unleashed in the East, too. Again, capping off the early part of Priest. And it might, at least for me, the best part of Priest. Again, they went in a very different direction, I would argue, after this, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. But like I say, if you've never heard these albums, do yourself a favor. Okay. When I was much younger, I just assumed that these albums that I was talking about were completely genuine recordings of a specific show, right? Yeah, when we're younger, you're always a bit naive. And admittedly, not a lot had come out about these albums anyway. We've found out more about what these albums really were about, at least some of them, as time has gone on, right? But with time, I pieced things together, as a lot of fans do. I realized that these classics were modified, sometimes quite extensively, and that some are actually not that live after all. So, I mean, a few balloons were burst there, I guess you could say, in some ways, right? But as it turns out, not much has changed in more recent times. While some artists will make a point of stating no overdubs, and they're very clear on that on the album, Slayer was a good example of that, most will do something to enrich the quality of the recordings, okay? So let's just say from the onset, virtually any live album, and I don't really care what you're listening to. I mean, the exception would be like a true bootleg, which we'll get to that as well. But virtually any live album will be studio enhanced to a degree, right? It'll be enhanced to get levels reasonably consistent so that the voices and the instruments are audible and or not overwhelming, that sort of thing. So try to bring things into balance as best you can, right? Yet most will go beyond this basic type of mixing. So like I say, every live album is going to be mixed a little bit, okay? And most people aren't going to have a problem with this. I guess the purest of the pure will have a problem, but most people are going to be, okay, that's fine, you know? But as we'll see, there's sort of a slippery slope here for bands that really want to get involved, you know, have their live material doctored, if you like, in the studio. Right. So almost everybody's going to do some basic mixing of a live album before they release it. Okay. So most people are all right with that. Okay. But A live album is a product of many concerts, typically, right? Most iconic live albums are not one show that I naively used to think, well, that's one show, that's what happened. No, more times than not, live albums are a compilation of live shows, right? Now, this can be a couple of different things. This might involve choosing the best performances from a tour, right? The best songs, the ones that came off the best live, choosing those, right? Or literally stitching songs together, such as dropping a guitar solo from one show into a song from a different night. Okay, so now we're getting more and more involved in the studio as we go along here, right? We can add to that. In addition, it's not unusual for musicians to add studio overdubs to portions of live tapes to correct and replace, say, out-of-tune guitars or voices that got lost in the mix or out-of-time drums and so on and so on. So that's literally the band coming into this. So they have the live tapes and the band coming in and replacing certain aspects. So they're overdubbing in the studio, or in some cases, not even the band members. The producer might bring even another guitarist, right, to fix the mistakes, so to speak, right? So now here we're doing a lot of studio enhancement at this point. And then maybe at the most extreme, there are certain live releases, and we really got to put live in quotation marks here, that are actually entirely manufactured in the studio, crowd noise and all, right? While such albums may be a reasonable depiction of the live experience, which is, I guess, what they're trying to achieve, in reality, these are studio albums, right? Promoted usually quite deceptively as live, because again, when they come out, it's not like they're going to say on, oh, this is meant to sound live, even though we produce it in the studio. No, you're leaving that out, right? You're saying, it's a live album, and you're kind of leaving out the information. Well, actually, it isn't. We did it all in the studio. We just made it sound live, right? Okay, so like I say, that's sort of a continuum, right? All live albums will have usually some basic mixing, but then it can go all the way down to, okay, you're dropping different songs from from different nights. It's a collage of different shows to create what sounds like a complete concert, to overdubbing guitars and vocals in the studio, to really just completely manufacturing in the studio, right? Okay. So the notable exceptions to the utilization of substantial enhancements would be bootlegs. Okay, not much is going to happen with a bootleg, because a bootleg by definition is an unauthorized or illegal live recording, right? So the band has nothing to do with it. So that's not going to be touched up at all. Maybe, again, possibly basic mixing, but that's it. FM, or more recently, live streaming events or broadcasts. Okay, those are usually pretty authentic. There's not much that's going to happen to those because they're literally happening live in time, right? So again, maybe some basic mixing if you buy a CD of that broadcast or something, but not much at all, right? Or soundboard recordings, which have become kind of the rage lately, right? Again, there's not much touch-up going to happen there either, right? So even though these are highly authentic representations of a full concert, not cherry picking, but that's exactly what went down that night, some minimum level of mixing in a studio will often occur, as I'm saying, but not to the point where usually it's going to bother anybody, right? Of note, though, and there's a trade-off here, bootleg, soundboards, and broadcasts can vary significantly in sound quality, right? Some are extremely rough, like some bootlegs. Again, you might love the tour and wow, what a selection of songs. They don't play these anymore or whatever. But then you put it on and you listen to it, and it's just like, it's almost unlistenable. It's just way too rough, right? Whereas some can be pretty good, right? Some can be pretty good. But almost none of them can compete with official live albums in terms of audio quality. Again, the performances might be great, but in terms of fidelity, right? They can't compete. I've yet to hear a bootleg, an FM broadcast, or a soundboard that's going to sound as good as the official live albums. They almost never exist, right? I'll admit, there's the odd one that might come kind of close, but as a rule, they're generally not even close in terms of sound quality. Okay, so let's dig into this a little deeper by looking at one specific live album for a minute or two, and then the controversies surrounding it. And as we're going to see, As with so many things in this series, I believe there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of black and white here. There's a lot of shades of gray. The situation's actually more complicated than people might, think at first blush. Anyway, we'll see what you think as I go through this. So, consider the case of Thin Lizzy. And I'll try not to get too fanboyish here. I absolutely love Thin Lizzy, but I'll have to say a couple things probably. So Thin Lizzy was led by the incomparable Phil Lynott. He vocals, bass, and he was the main songwriter, really the driving wheel of the band always. And drummer extraordinaire Brian Downey, one of my all-time favorite drummers. Thin Lizzy released a strain of critically acclaimed albums throughout the 70s and into the early 1980s. Although Thin Lizzy's cult following remains enthusiastic even to this day. I mean, if you're a Lizzy fan, you're kind of all the way in, right? It seems. This was a band that never reached the heights of, say, Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple in popularity. Okay, so again, very, very strong cult following, but they never kind of got to the big leagues kind of thing, you might say, at least in most parts of the world. Still, much of the wider rock world will have at least passing knowledge of a few things about Thin Lizzy. So again, the wider audience will, even if they're not deep fans, there's a couple characteristics about the band most people will probably know, at least if you're a hard rock fan. First, Thin Lizzy was famous for twin lead guitar harmonies. That's a lot of people know about that. I mean, Iron Maiden, obviously, I think took a lot of ideas from Thin Lizzy. Thin Lizzy was probably the first to do that with the harmony guitars and then ripping solos, but lots of times the guitarists, they would harmonize almost like voices, right? Really quite amazing how they would do that. Maybe Wishbone Ash was the first to do that, but they weren't really hard rock. Lizzy did it in a hard rock way. And then since then, lots of metal bands have done that. So Lizzy was a blueprint for a lot of bands, I think, in that regard. And then also related to that, Thin Lizzy housed a remarkable number of extraordinary guitarists through its run. I often think of Thin Lizzy, now this is at a much lower scale, right? But the Yardbirds, one of the most famous things about the Yardbirds is that, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and Eric Clapton played in the Yardbirds at a point in time. You can kind of say the same thing for Thin Lizzy in some ways at a different level, I suppose. But it's incredible the number of amazing guitar players that the band had at various times. Eric Bell, Gary Moore, Brian Robertson, Scott Garham, Snowy White, John Sykes, I mean, and others. But these would, for people who know hard rock, all of these guitarists need no introduction. Let's put it that way. Another thing that, more casual hard rock fans would know about Thin Lizzy, even if they're not deep fans, in spite of being a musician's band, Thin Lizzy was capable of writing highly melodic tunes, some of which have become evergreen classics on various radio and satellite playlists to this day. So everybody knows The Boys Are Back in Town. That's kind of their signature song. Probably Jailbreak too is really, really well known. Thin Lizzy had they had quite a few other well-known songs that I think are mostly known, probably more to European audiences. In North America, it's those two songs in particular, right? So most people are going to know at least a couple Lizzy tunes. And three, which relates specifically to where we're talking about in this paper, Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous album will make virtually any hard rock fan's list of best live albums from the 1970s. Anytime I see a list of, what were the best live albums in hard rock of all time, not even necessarily the 1970s, but Live and Dangerous is almost always on that list, right? So again, that's what, this is their iconic album in a lot of ways. I remember buying Live and Dangerous when it first came out in 1978. So yeah, I'm pretty old. And being completely overwhelmed by it, right? So much so that I rapidly scooped up, as quickly as a paperboy's income would allow, every Thin Lizzy studio album available. Like it was just boom, immediately, just kapow, right? What is this band? I need everything. Indeed, the intense impact of Live and Dangerous on my musical psyche was rivaled only by Deep Purple's Made in Japan and Kiss's Alive 1, which I purchased just a couple of years earlier. And then there were other live albums that did the same thing. But at that time, it was like those were the two live albums for me, Deep Purple's and Kiss. And then Lizzy came along to, oh my gosh, here's another one, right? Okay, so that's the fanboy stuff out of the way. Sorry about that. During Thin Lizzy's active run, there were only two other live albums released. Okay, so when they were around from the 70s, early 80s, they only really officially released only 3 live albums. So there was Live and Dangerous, Live Killers came out in 1981, and the career-ending Life in 1983. Now, Live Killers was fine, but it was only a 6-song mini LP, so it felt more like an appetizer compared to the double live album that Live and Dangerous was. And Life, yeah, Life was a double live, and it featured Lizzy guitar players from all eras. This was part of their farewell tour, actually. And while the set lists and performances are excellent, I believe, I always remember being let down by the overall sound quality of the album. It just couldn't compare to Live and Dangerous, particularly in terms of high fidelity. And really, almost every review I've ever read of Life back then, and even still as they come out over time, will pretty much say the same thing. Great songs, great performances, but the album sounds really muddy and underproduced, really, I guess you'd say. Okay, more about that later, because I mean, Live and Dangerous just is this shining beacon of high fidelity, whereas everything else live, tends not to be even close. And I'll give you a little more evidence of that coming up. Soon after the band's official demise, and definitely by the time of Lynnett's death in 1986, rumors intensified regarding extensive overdubbing of Live and Dangerous. Of course, at that point, nobody really knew, but a lot of people suspected. It just sounded a little too good to be true, right? Widespread allegations were levied at other live albums of the day as well. Kiss Alive. I mean, it's common knowledge that there were overdubs done there. For that matter, Alive 2, which came out a couple years later, is like completely not live. It's completely live in the studio by Kiss. UFO Strangers in the Night. Again, the jury's out on that one a little bit, but most people think that, some will say there's a ton of overdubs on that. Others, not so much. It's controversial as well. Judas Priest Unleashed in the East, again, a lot of talk about it over the years, and how live is this really? Again, they've come clean on that. It's not really that live, actually. And there's others, right? Okay, so over time, back to Thin Lizzy. Over time, demand for Thin Lizzy live documentations has not abated, and it seems that material is released from the vaults every decade. So for a Lizzy fanatic like me, that's great. I can't get enough live stuff, whatever, give it to me, I'm there, right? And so I've collected a number of these. There are others, but these would probably be, I would say, the main live things that have come out from from the Thin Lizzy vaults. So there's the UK tour of 75, which I think came out about 10 years ago. It highlights the Fighting album. Still Dangerous live in Philadelphia. Again, that came out not too long ago, about 10 years ago. It features the Bad Reputation era from 77. The Boys Are Back in Town, Sydney, 1978. That came out just last year. It features a rare tour with Gary Moore, so it's worth it just for that, and it predates the work on Black Rose. And BBC Radio 1 Live in Concert was the last tour, and it features John Sykes on guitar. And in addition, Thin Lizzy's studio catalog has been given the remastered deluxe treatment, as so many iconic bands have. And nearly every one of these re-releases, and I'm talking like a lot of the studio albums, right, contain bonus live songs. So in the last, I'm going to say 20, 30 years, we've been given a lot more live material from Thin Lizzy, way more than we got when they actually were an active band, right? Okay, so of note to this discussion, though, is that the sound quality for any of these aforementioned concert material, whether it be the bonus tracks, on the deluxe versions, or a lot of these live albums that have come out recently, none of them sound even close to Live and Dangerous. Again, I'm not talking about the songs or the performances, because in a lot of cases, that's great. I'm talking the sound quality, okay? They don't sound anything close to how Live and Dangerous sounds. So the obvious question becomes, why? Why is that the case? Well, I think we know why, but we're going to delve into this controversy a little bit. So again, it's not as straightforward as we might think. Okay, so the subject of studio augmentation was broached yet again in the liner notes by Rock Candy in 2011, who actually did a good job of this, of the expanded version of Live and Dangerous, which, like I say, came out just about, I guess, over a decade ago. With the reissue, But actually, as it turns out, even though Rock Candy did a good job of talking about the overdub controversy of Live and Dangerous, not a lot's been settled, really. As it turns out, as the liner notes talk about, on one hand, the original producer of the album, Tony Visconti, right? This is important because he produced the album. He'd be the guy doing the overdubbing, essentially, right? Stated that about 75% of Live and Dangerous was recorded in the studio. So kind of most of it, right? Including, notably, he claims all the vocals, all the guitars, and bass, right? So what's left? And I'll tell you something else. To my ears, the crowd response is obviously exaggerated as well compared to other Thin Lizzy live packages that have come out. So you could surmise that the only thing really authentically live about Live and Dangerous is Brian Downey's percussion. That's kind of it. At least if you sort of piece together what the producer is telling you. Okay. But in those same liner notes, the liner notes also explain that Phil Lynott and more recently Scott Garham, who actually was the longest serving guitarist in Thin Lizzy, assert that Visconti's claims, the producer, are grossly overstated and that Thin Lizzy always took great pride in being a genuine live band. Okay, so while it's clear that Live and Dangerous was called from various shows, right? It's not one show, it's pieced together by different performances. No one's denying that. And it's also clear that overdubs definitely occurred. Nobody's denying that. Where the controversy comes in, it's the extent of studio enhancement that's highly contested by those who presumably should know. Okay, so what should we make of this? We got the guy who produced the album telling us it's basically hardly live at all. And then we got two of the key musicians, right? Phil Lynott was always the leader. And then the longest serving guitarist telling us, no. The producer's really exaggerating this, right? That this is kind of wrong. And to the point where I think Scott Garham actually gets really bothered when he still gets the question even today. Like it really bugs him even to have to answer it, right? So what do we make of this? I offer 4 observations about the Live and Dangerous controversy, and then I extrapolate the issues surrounding authenticity in general. So we'll finish with that, okay? So see what you think of this. So I'll be using Live and Dangerous sort of as a springboard, but I'll get to other issues surrounding authenticity as well here. Okay, so on one hand, there's no question that Thin Lizzy was an exceptional live band. And I'm not even just saying that as a fanboy. I mean, I think there's evidence there because this is a band I've listened to closely over the years. I've got as much as you can possibly collect in terms of live material. I've listened to them for 45 years. I've got official releases. I've got bootlegs, which I haven't even mentioned. I know this band inside and out. And I can conclude, again, in my own humble little way, I can conclude, though, quite clearly that this band undoubtedly could deliver live. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. And I personally detect no in-concert embellishing whatsoever, right? As I compare songs from night to night on different tours, things like that. No, they were the real deal live. In other words, there's no evidence that Thin Lizzy had off-stage performers or used pre-recording backing tracks when they played live. I don't hear any of that, right? Hence, and that's important for a reason I'm going to get, because I think this is where, when we're trying to understand, well, the producer's saying one thing, the players are saying another. I think they're kind of saying slightly different things here. Hence, when Lynott and Gorham, the players, defend the liveness of Live and Dangerous, which is arguably their most famous album, I think they're really trying to maintain the band's well-earned reputation as a stellar live act, and perhaps less so defending the actual album. I think that's really what they're saying, right? The same can be said for Kiss and Judas Priest, for example, right? They most definitely put out doctored live albums. Like everybody knows that now, right? Yet, that does not mean that they didn't provide an authentic musical spectacle on any given night, at least in decades gone by. Maybe Kiss is embellishing things a little bit now, but in the past, I don't think they did very much. So here's where I am with this. I wonder if bands worry that live album controversies will lead to them being pigeonholed into the same category as, say, choreographed pop stars, right? Which is not a good place to be if you're a hard rock metal guy, right? Because in fairness, an embellished live album and an authentic live show are two different things. Okay, so I'm afraid, I think what's happening here, a lot of bands get really defensive about when they have to defend that an iconic live album was doctored in the studio, right? Because I think they're afraid that people are going to say, well, okay, if you kind of cheated there, are you cheating always, right? Are you really live when I go see you? Are all your other albums kind of just studio things, right? So I think they're afraid that there's a slippery slope there is how the public views it, okay? So anyway, that's, I think, one important thing to keep in mind. There's a difference between a live album that's embellished and an authentic live show. Okay, they are two different things. Okay, but sometimes I think fans put them together, which probably isn't fair. Okay, another sort of point I'll make and then sort of widen it out a little bit. The fact that Live and Dangerous does sound so much better than anything else Thin Lizzy has released, I'm talking in terms of live material, strongly suggests that studio enhancements were pursued. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? So what explains the diverging opinions between the producer and the players, as I was talking about? So let's talk about that a little more head on here. Okay, I think there's a few possible explanations as to why there's a divergence here. On one hand, it's possible that Lynott and Gorham, again, the leader of the band and the longest serving guitarist, were present for only portions of the engineering and production procedure and honestly don't know the true extent of what went on. They might not know that the producer did all these extra overdubbings because they were only at the, it takes a while usually to produce an album, right? That can take weeks or months. A lot of the times the musicians are only there for part of the time, or in some cases hardly there at all. They don't really know what goes on. The producer does, right? Because the producers and engineers are there the whole time. But a lot of times the players kind of come and go in the process. So they truly might not know. They might just assume, no, that's live to me, but they might not really know how much Visconti really did, right? So that's possible, right? Another possibility, perhaps their definition, and here again, I'm talking about the players, of what constitutes only a few overdubs, because they admit that. They're not saying there was none. They're saying, oh, just a few, really, no big deal. Well, what their definition of a few is might really differ from what other people think a few is, right? So again, that is subjective, we got to say, right? Or let's be honest here. Maybe they are telling a few white lies here, right? Phil Lynott when he was alive and then Scott Gorham later on. Maybe they're being a little loose with the truth, and it's really about legacy protection at all costs. And if that's the case, it's kind of hard to blame. Not that I condone lying, but you maybe can understand why. Because let's face it, the producer who is saying it's basically all overdubbed, the producer who, in fairness, would be the most involved in the process, he would theoretically know the most here, but at the same time has the least to lose by coming clean. Right? It's arguably the musician's reputation that's most at stake here. They're the ones that have to defend it. They're the ones that have to live with this. The producer doesn't really care, right? I think all of this needs to be understood when we're assessing these types of controversies. Who has the most to lose here? Who has the least to lose, right? All this type of thing. But again, I think those first couple explanations are very plausible, right? The players off the top, they probably don't have a clue how much was really done in the studio. Like they might be completely oblivious to that. They just think they know, right? Or their definition of what is too many overdubs could be very different from others, et cetera, et cetera. So again, all of this should be taken into account. All right, let's go in a slightly different direction here. But again, I think this is important to the overall discussion of what's going on. In the era of Live and Dangerous, live albums used to be a major event, and they were. Like younger fans probably don't quite appreciate that because live albums come out all the time now, right? Back then, they were an event, stuff we just couldn't wait to get to, right? Oh, I can't believe they're putting out a live album. That is so cool. I don't hear people say that much anymore. So it's a different time. Live albums used to be a major event, a key benchmark in a band's career, and were actually quite multifunctional. So as I was saying, they were often, these important temporal posts in the band's career, but they had more than one function too in the past, right? Of course, such releases promoted the opportunity to experience a favorite band live, to a large degree, I guess. But they also served as greatest hits collections, okay? That was the other function of these things, which I don't think is so much true today. I'll get to that, right? But back then, yes, they were the live documentation, but they were also basically greatest hits compilations, right? Therefore, the fact that Live and Dangerous was manufactured to sound so polished unquestionably increased its appeal as a hits package, and importantly, heightened the potential for acceptance by a wider audience. And to a large degree, it worked. Almost all of those albums I listed above, right? Not just Live and Dangerous, but all the other iconic albums, in some cases, are some of the band's biggest selling albums. Okay. So, like I say, back in those days, they were meant to be greatest hits collections as well. Yeah, they're live, but they're also greatest hits. And we're trying to break into a bigger audience here, right? But I would contrast that to live albums today, which actually aren't that special. I mean, at the end of Rush's career, I mean, I can't tell you how many live albums came out. One or two live albums came out after every studio album, it seemed, right? And then lots after, right? It was incredible. Iron Maiden releases live albums like crazy these days, right? They're not special. They have a different role today, though, I would say. Conversely, live albums in more contemporary times tend to be much more narrow in mission. Their sole purpose today is to provide documentation of a particular tour. They're not meant to be greatest hits packages anymore, right? And so because of that, there's less pressure to make them sound perfect, okay? So let's just look at that a little deeper here. Live albums today, I think, the key target for live albums today, or say even the last 20, 30 years, is undoubtedly a band's hardcore following and not really anybody else. They're not meant for the mainstream or to try to break the band. It's really for the hardcore fan now, right? Which again was different in the 70s. So indeed, mainstream tastes and more casual fans are not going to buy any of the following. They're not going to care. They don't care. They're not going to try to stream a rough sounding FM broadcast. They're not going to care about that. The hardcore fan might, but the mainstream won't care. That type of live album has no appeal. They don't care about buying an instant live CD that you can purchase right after a show, right? A lot of bands do that now. You can go see the band live, and then you can actually get that show on your way out. You can buy the CD or a download code or whatever, right? You can get that. That's for the hardcore. The mainstream fans not going to care about that, right? Again, a live product that only the deep fans will worry about, or they're not even going to care about. I would argue a very well produced, say, concert Blu-ray or DVD, if it features lesser known songs from more obscure albums. Again, that's for the hardcore these days. No, today's mainstream consumer will just concentrate on the hits, like they always have, right? Typically these days via a playlist when they're streaming. Okay, and they're going to leave it at that. They're not going to care about these live albums that are coming out. In the past, the live albums were marketed to them. Now they're not. Okay, why is that important? Because today, with the reduced need for live albums to be surrogate greatest hits packages, right? One would think that the pressure for studio enhancements would be decreased. There's no need for us to make them sound pristine and perfect because they're not going after they're not going after the mainstream fan anymore anyway, because that's what they like, especially, right? Okay. But there's an irony here, which I think is really interesting. What I just put together, I mean, I'm sure I'm not unique there. Other people have figured this out, but it just, light bulb went on for me. The irony is that while a contemporary group might be giving their fans a more genuine live recording today, so what you're getting if you buy a live album, say, or stream it, that's truly what came off the stage. So it's more genuine than, say, what you might have bought in the 70s, right? But the irony is what the band may be doing in concert in real time may be actually less authentic than it used to be. If they're using pre-recorded backing tracks, for example, as I talked about in the last episode. So here's the interesting thing, I think. In some cases, the overdubs have moved out of the studio onto the stage, right? If you kind of see where I'm going with this, right? So bands today, you could say the live album you're buying is more authentic from the perspective of you're getting what actually came off the stage. But what's coming off the stage these days isn't as authentic if they're using, pre-recorded backing tracks and they're playing live. So it's just shifted. So we're still overdubbing in a lot of cases. It's just we're overdubbing in a different spot in the process, right? Anyway. Last point I'll make. It's important to reiterate that Live and Dangerous and other titles with similar controversies remain favorites for countless heavy music fans, regardless of what they actually are. So let's not forget that. A lot of people love these albums, and whatever they are, they sure sound great. Okay, so that's fair enough, right? It's also crucial to acknowledge that some classic live albums are indeed live in every sense of the word. Yeah, some basic mixing, but that's it. Again, pretty much anything Deep Purple does would be a great example there. So it really boils down to how much the degree of authenticity impacts a listener's enjoyment. So at the end of the day, while we might point fingers at the artists if we think they're overdubbing too much, it really comes down to us, the listeners, right? Some will be oblivious and won't care. I don't care what they did. If whatever it took them to make it sound like this, I'm cool because I love the way it sounds. Other people are going to be really irritated by it, right? By overdubs, live albums, that'll really diminish their view of that album, maybe the band, et cetera, et cetera. So some people this really bugs, right? Okay, just a second or two on the people that it really bugs, right? I wonder about this. Is hearing the studio polish the greatest irritation, or is the real annoyance just in knowing that a given live album is heavily embellished? So what I'm saying is, if you're listening to a live album, right, and you don't really know what its origins are, but it's like you're thinking to yourself, oh man, there's only one guitarist in the band, but I swear I hear 2 guitar tracks here, or those vocals are way too clean. Something doesn't sound right here. Okay, that's one thing. And if that kind of stuff bugs you, I can see why then you'd be bothered. But if you got bothered when you found out, so in other words, you were rocking out to, all these, Kiss Alive 1 for years. Oh, this is the greatest album I ever heard. And then when you found out it was overdubbed, suddenly you got angry. Well, that's another thing, right? And I think that's sort of, I would argue that's a less justified criticism than maybe the former I was describing. If with your own ears, you're thinking this sounds way too polished to be live, that's one thing. But if you loved it until somebody told you it was overdubbed, I think that's another thing. Okay. Still others, though. Let's be fair. They may prefer that every recording be as pristine as possible, and how an artist gets there is no consequence to them, which is a completely fair point of view as well, right? This is all, again, as always, this is all very much eye or ear of the beholder territory. But I think some tendencies can be generalized, and that's what I'll pick up on in the last part of this series, part 6, where I'm going to talk about who cares about sound and authenticity. So who really cares about this stuff? And I'm going to argue if you're an audiophile, sorry, if you're a purist or if you're a collector, inevitably you will care about sound and authenticity, or at least if you have tendencies in those directions. Okay. If you don't, you probably won't. So I hope you'll join me for the last part of this series. All right. Anyway, until then, I hope everything's going great for everyone out there. Take care.